Crankbaits are the most versatile of the lures at presenting a fly. They can also be the most difficult to figure out how to fish. Here I'm going to show you the proper methods of using a crankbait to present a fly. First, you need to select the proper crankbait. Whether using a floating or sinking crankbait, it should be thin and aerodynamic. Those fat crankbaits at bass, panfish, and pike-like won't work well for trout. Most fish found in trout streams tend to be narrow and aerodynamic, and your lure should imitate them. I recommend floating crankbaits in the size 1/16 to 1/8 ounce. You should also have some sinking crankbaits in the 1/8 ounce size. There are many brands and models. Usually if the crankbait is thin and not double jointed, it will be fine. I also recommend bright colors so you can see them better. You will need to remove the front treble hook. This is important to reduce tangles. The method of attaching your crankbait to your line is important. Shown here is the incorrect method. Tying your line to both ends of a crankbait reduces lure action and increases tangles and line twists. The correct method is to attach the crankbait to the main line via a swivel. For dry flies, you will want to attach the swivel to the rear of the crankbait. For nymphs and wet flies, I recommend attaching the front of the crankbait to the swivel. At the top of the swivel, in the same place where the main line is attached, you will also tie your fluorocarbon leader connecting your flies to the main line. There are several reasons behind this connection method. First, this prevents the line from interfering with the natural action of the crankbait. Secondly, it allows the crankbait to twirl during the casting process without wrapping the leader line around the main line. And if the leader line does occasionally wrap once or twice around the main line, it'll have little effect on your presentation. Third, it allows you to easily swap out a crankbait for either a different crankbait or a spoon so you can adjust to different situations. When fishing dry flies, I used to cut off the diving lip to make my crankbait more streamlined and reduce any disturbance it would make on the water, but have since decided to keep the diving lip on. The small amount of resistance provided by the diving lip is useful to keep the lure from sliding across the water when I lift my rod tip up to keep the line off the water. Here I'm fishing some dry flies in a pool behind the boulder surrounded by a fast current on either side. The slight resistance provided by the diving lip is just enough to prevent the lure from sliding towards me when I lift my rod tip to keep the line off the water and away from those strong currents. I can then keep my flies in the strike zone longer. It would be very difficult to fish that pool behind the boulder with a traditional fly rod. Besides dry flies, crankbaits are very effective at fishing nymphs and wet flies. In streams that have a moderate to fast current, I usually just let everything drift with the current. But in slower streams, it can be helpful to give some extra movement to your flies. In that situation, I will connect the swivel to the front of the crankbait in the usual forward manner and make sure I've got a treble hook on the back. So I'll fish this, and if I just leave it drift down the stream, I'll catch a few fish. But a lot of times I like to give a little twitch when I'm reeling it in. And you know, when you give it a twitch, the fly moves a bit more, and trout like to see a little movement in their flies, sometimes, and you catch more fish by giving a little twitch. But of course, the crankbait, you're moving it forward, it's still got that diving lip on, and when you twitch it, that crankbait, which is floating on the top, still floats. It dives, it twists, it turns, it makes all kinds of motion. And a lot of times, the trout will come up and they'll hit the crankbait. It's still got a treble hook on, and it'll still hook fish. Usually I'll catch most of my fish on the fly below, but I might catch a third of my fish on the crankbait up on the surface. This has worked very well. It works excellent on brook trout. I've caught brown trout on it, rainbows, cutthroats. It's a pretty cool method to fish. You might wonder, is one treble hook on the back of a crankbait, is that enough to hook a trout? Yes, it is. You only need one treble hook. I once caught a brook trout, which I hooked it so well in one treble hook, I actually hooked it twice. Twice at once. I hooked it in the mouth and the tail. Imagine that. So one treble hook is all you need on a crankbait. When fishing smaller streams, there will be times when a tree limb makes it nearly impossible to cast a lure to a good-looking spot. With a floating crankbait, you can get upstream of the spot and drift your flies through it, during which time you have a good chance of catching a fish on the flies. When reeling your flies back upstream, you then have a good chance to catch a fish on the crankbait. In these situations, I like to cast once, then drift and reel my floating crankbait and flies several times through the hole. This will not scare the fish. A similar situation may exist when fishing a shallow stream in a downstream manner. Ideally, you'll have a large rock or tree to conceal your presence. If you don't, the fish may see you and refuse to feed. Here, I'm fishing a fly behind a spinner. I have to get so close to the spot to reach the fish, I've probably scared anything there. In this scene, I demonstrate the method whereby I keep as far away from the pool as possible, cast my floating crankbait and fly to the top of the pool, let everything drift through the pool, and then reel it back up. This can be repeated several times. The ability to fish a crankbait in shallow water without spooking trout is truly impressive. In the scenes shown here, I'm catching trout from water only 9 to 12 inches deep, drifting a dry fly or ant with a 1/16 ounce floating crankbait. I sometimes cast to an area multiple times before the fish hit. This water was extremely clear, and the trout were wary but did not get spooked by the crankbait. Here's one minor little problem. When I'm fishing a floating crankbait and I have a couple flies below it, let's say a couple nymphs or a couple wet flies, I'll settle upon a certain leader length, maybe 3 feet or 4 feet, and then for the remainder of the time I'm fishing that way, I'm pretty much settled on that leader length. It usually works pretty good most of the time, but every now and then I may come across a deep hole where I want to increase the leader length so I can reach those fish that are at the bottom of the hole. The solution to this problem is not to retie and change your leader length. Instead, you should disconnect your floating crankbait from your swivel and swap in a sinking crankbait. The sinking crankbait can be cast upstream and drifted back on a tight line. This will allow your nymphs to go several feet deeper. You will want to use a brightly colored crankbait such as hot pink, fluorescent orange, or bright yellow to detect subtle strikes. Even though the crankbait may be underwater a couple feet, it can usually still be seen well enough. I prefer a 1/8 ounce sinking crankbait, and with the front treble hook removed, they tend to sink at a slow rate. Normally, this is ideal for most situations. Another side effect of fishing with a sinking crankbait is once you get a foot or two below the surface, the current tends to slow down considerably. This is especially true in areas with an irregular bottom structure, and those are the areas most frequented by trout. By fishing this way, I can often reduce the speed of my drifts by up to 50%. This also allows the nymphs to go deeper because at the slower speeds, they encounter less water resistance. Furthermore, when encountering areas that are too deep for a sinking crankbait to reach, you can easily swap out the crankbait for a fast sinking spoon. Let me give you an example. I was fishing this broad, shallow area you see here using a slow sinking crankbait. I kept it on a tight line with my rod tip high and was having success catching brook trout. Immediately above this section was a deep trench that spanned the entire width of the stream. The deepest part had a fast chute of current over it. I knew the largest trout in the area would be at the bottom of the deepest section, but with the fast current on the surface, there was no way I could get my flies down there using a sinking crankbait. Because it was only attached by a swivel, I quickly swapped it out and replaced it with a 1/8 ounce Castmaster spoon, which has a much faster sink rate. On my first cast to the top of the trench, I let the spoon sink near the bottom, about 6 feet deep, and began giving it some jigging motion. Within a few seconds, I hooked a really big brook trout on one of the trailing flies. I had it on for about 10 seconds and then the hook came out. While the fish may have gotten away, this still illustrates my point. By being prepared to switch from a floating crankbait to a sinking crankbait to a spoon, you will be able to effectively fish all your flies in all kinds of situations. Whether the water is shallow or deep, fast or slow, wherever you go, you can get your flies to the fish by just taking a few seconds to put on the proper type of lure for the situation. This is also the reason spinners aren't my favorite lure for fly fishing. You have to tie your fly leader line to the rear of the spinner, making it inefficient to switch to a different lure. You would have to cut and retie your line to do that. With a spoon or crankbait, all you have to do is reconnect the lure to the swivel. If you remove some or all of the hooks from a floating crankbait, you should modify it to give some of the weight back so it casts well. Obtain some tungsten putty, available from most fly fishing shops. This is meant as a lead alternative and is very sticky. Apply the tungsten putty to the crankbait where the front hook attachment resides. The putty will stick to the crankbait forever. Next, place the crankbait into some water and test its flotation. You can create a lure that sinks slowly, ideal for deep runs with nymphs. Here I'm reducing the weight so it floats. After achieving the proper density level, dry the tungsten putty and apply a layer of top coat fingernail polish, available from any place that sells fingernail polish. This gives the putty a hard shell so it won't stick to other lures.